Welcome to Macon Memories. Today is April the 15th, 2008, and I'm here with the second session with Dennis Howard.
Good morning. Dennis Howard, class of 1972, graduating in 73.
You mentioned yesterday your experiences about coming to Randolph-Macon, and you said that it took a lot of courage to come to Randolph-Macon as one of the very first black students. You told me that your friends back home said that they would not have done the reverse. That is, they would not have entered a majority black community as one of very few white students. Can you talk about that thought process and the input from others that went into the decision to come to Randolph-Macon, or that generated that response?
Yes, again, I think you have to look at everything in the historical context. And when you think about the history of this country and slavery in America, 1619 to 1865, 90 so years of Jim Crow, and then me coming to Randolph-Macon right in the beginning of the Civil Rights era with all of the social and economic explosions related to the deaths of President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert Kennedy, and Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, and all that went with the death of the Freedom Riders and the sit-ins. It was a very divisive time, and people had to really check their values and see what they stood for and what America stood for. Now, during that time, excuse me, there were students going off to school. I was second generation in my family going to college, and there were other blacks in a similar situation. The safe choice was to go to a black school because the black school had all of the social supports to support a black individual, and you knew that the fight was going to be a different fight and that you would be tested in safe ways. In a white school, it was done on quantity. I had started junior high school I was in about the third or fourth class at Stratford Junior High School. And Stratford Junior High School in Arlington, Virginia was the first school in the state of Virginia that broke the policy of massive resistance and integrated. There was resistance from the student body there, from the administration, and all while you were going to school, the newspapers were filled every day with information having to do with civil rights changes and reactions therein. So you were constantly aware that everything you were doing was under the microscope as a black student in a white school. Now, it was the white students who told me later that they would not have done the reverse in terms of going to a black school in urban city at a time when there was so much political upheaval, and they were the pioneer, because I was the first four-year black to graduate from Randolph-Macon and the second black overall behind Haywood Payne from Virginia Union. And when you leave home and the safety of what was then the black ghettos, where you had a history of segregation, separate and unequal facilities and services, and you're used to riding on the back of the bus, colored water fountains, colored bathrooms, no public accommodations on public transportation, no public accommodation in hotels. when you pick up the newspaper and you hear about Ku Klux Klan rallies, you hear about lynchings, your relatives tell you that your generation is the first generation of black women that had controls of their bodies where they could freely walk the streets without being accosted by white men, where the court systems will listen and give them a hearing and not assume that they solicited whatever type of unwanted attention they got from white men. You don't know, as a black individual going down the road and leaving the safety of your church, family, and community, what you're going to. It's almost the same as if you are 1200 AD, 1300 AD, and you're sailing the ocean and you don't know if the end of the world is going to come once you hit the horizon. You don't know what's out there. So it was an unknown situation.
Yes, thank you. Did Paul Webb, the basketball coach who recruited you, address these issues with you? I mean, he wanted you to come to Randolph-Macon. Did you all talk about that?
Let me think. I don't recall anything that Coach Paul Webb said about me being a minority student coming to Randolph-Macon. Other than he focused on basketball, he was very much focused and a taskmaster on recruiting. Later on, when I went to the Shenandoah Valley and that corridor along Route 58 between Roanoke and Hampton-Sydney, where it was the breadbasket of the South, and there was still a lot of backlash about the Civil War. It wasn't uncommon to be called a racial name. And I was told by other members of the basketball team, particularly Charlie Weston, that people like Fred Carter, who is now a television sports announcer, had gone to Mount St. Mary College, and he was one of the first blacks into the Mason-Dixon Conference, and he preceded me by several years. And Charlie Weston said it was nothing for this individual to be called names and to stop in the middle of the game and to give gestures and the bird and to exchange comments with fans. Now, I had, when I would go to places like Hampton-Sydney, Roanoke, Washington Lee University, Bridgewater, I would be called names. And surprisingly, when I went to places like Washington College in Maryland, some northern places, I was also called names. And it wasn't that much. I mean, it was a situation where you might have one person, two people in a crowd. So most of the people didn't really need the sports code that they now have, where they say that our friends are our guests and we have certain standards and we expect you to show those standards or risk being put out of the game or something like that. They really didn't need it because they had a sense of common decency. But at that time, Coach Paul Webb would pull me aside and say, Howard, just focus on the game. But it's really pretty hard to just focus on the game if you're the only black person on the bus and you remember Freedom Riders and the consequences there and the hostility that they encountered and the result. It's pretty hard not to think of, well, okay, I'm the fly in the buttermilk. I'm the only black student here. Am I safe? Because they took no precautions that I was aware of to protect me. It didn't require any type of armed situation or anything like that. I can't say they did or didn't take any type of security incidents, but security measures, but there really were no incidents. And after a while, once you got the learning curve in, and the market became aware of who you were, and they respected the fact that you were an outstanding player, and the refs start giving you a fair call on the games, because at first they didn't give you a fair call. You know, they would give you a quick whistle. And you, in the back of your mind, you always said, well, that's because I'm black, but you never knew. But there were times when I would come out and play defense, and I'd be sitting on the bench, you know, very quickly for little or nothing. And finally what happened was that the crowd and the market got used to the fact that you were there. They accepted it, and the attitude was such that, well, okay, he's one of the premier players in the league. We got to let him play. You know, this is after all sports and entertainment, and people came to see a game, and he's a part of that. So you came into your own, and you might have even got a few good calls, you know, or no calls.
How about when you were coming to Randolph-Macon, you were describing a couple of alumni who brought you down. Did they address the racial issue with you on your drive, or as they dropped you off?
No. My parents, my family, were the only ones really to address the racial issue. And if anything, they went overboard the other way in terms of being too safe and too protective. And they got black myths in there that really weren't myths. In my family, I had a few great uncles that experienced interracial dating at a time before Lovings versus the state of Virginia, when a white man took a case to the Supreme Court and changed the laws on interracial marriage to marry a black female. They had dated white females, and a couple of them were lynched. And so my mother remembered that. And when I started dating, she was very sure to tell me to be very safe about what I did. And she took the position that any mother would, that I was the baby, I was her only son, and she wasn't going to lose me at any cost. So they gave me that. Then I had a lot of my uncles to tell me that, well, back in the day, if there was an interracial situation in Fairfax County, the sheriffs would take 2 or 3 days to come because there was a lower staff number for the sheriffs in the Fairfax County. And when they came, if it was an interracial situation, they would always say something like, "Oh boy, what have you done now?" You know, and just assume that the black person was wrong. So I was prepared to go through some racial discrimination, but in that no one in my family had gone to a white school before. I had no way of knowing what the situations would be and how to deal with it. I pretty much had to think on my feet.
Did you find when you got to Randolph-Macon that the things you feared matched up with reality, or were you surprised by the way the things played out?
I had a mixed experience. In retrospect, I find that wherever you go, you're going to have good and bad people. And you can't look at a person's face and say they're black, white, red, or yellow, and they're going to be good or bad, even though at one time I thought that way. You have to see what's in a person's heart, and the only way you can do that is to evaluate their behavior and attitude over a period of time. And at Randolph-Macon, I had some positive and negative experiences. And there was resistance coming on. You know, people didn't want to sit by you. Some people didn't want to sit beside you. Some people called you names in a discreet way and just under their breath. Again, like I said, there was some resistance from some of the faculty in terms of the grades. Who the perception I got was that they figured that a black student wasn't going to do as well as a white student. In fact, I had in high school been told at Washington Lee High School by a guy named Mr. Wilson, who was a guidance counselor, that I should take vocational courses in the 10th grade. And my mother had already prepared me for that and told me that I was going to college, so take the academic courses. And so I told him that I was going to college, put me in college preparatory courses, and that if he had any problem with it, to talk to my mother. And he routed me in that direction. But I found out later that many other black students had been routed to vocational courses. And the carrot was, you can get good grades, but you wouldn't qualify for college requirements. And when I went and talked to my mother and my grandmother, I found that they had similar situations in their day. My mother had gone to the Manassas Industrial School in Manassas, Virginia, and at the time that she graduated, it was not infrequent that you would see in the newspaper, and I in fact saw it myself, in some job announcements that they would say that Jews and Negroes need not apply. In my grandmother's day, she went to school in the Purcellville area in Loudoun County, and at that time, blacks went to a one-room school in Lincoln or Brownville, Virginia, which is in Loudoun County. The Brownville section being the black section, the Lincoln section being the white section. And the school only went up to the 10th grade. And she was born like 1902 or something like that, went to school around 1910. 1906, 1907 on up until she was in the 6th grade, then she dropped out. But if you wanted to have a high school diploma in those days, you had to go to West Virginia, which was formerly Virginia in Harpers Ferry, to Stewart College, which was a college that was established for women, Indians, and minorities. And you had to go to finish those 2 years to get your high school diploma. And the discrimination for them was that many of the jobs required a high school diploma. So if you didn't have you weren't industrious enough to go to Stewart College to get your high school diploma, you were automatically tracked out of the system. So back to Randolph-Macon, it took probably about a year and a half to break, for the resistance to melt or to be tolerable. And it was very supportive to have two blacks, Larry Lassiter and Howard Stevens, come in with me. And there was one black that was a sophomore when I got here as a freshman. I don't remember his name, though. But he didn't finish at Randolph-Macon for whatever reason. And Howard Stevens and Larry Lassiter didn't finish at Randolph-Macon.
But they entered in the same class with you that fall.
They entered in the same class, and they went through pretty much what I went through. In fact, Howard Stevens went through more than what I went through because he pledged Lambda Chi. And at that time, there was a struggle to control hazing. And they were doing some wild things to people. And I, just in terms of my personality style, I was an independent person. I would join an organization, but I wouldn't be controlled by an organization. And when you're telling me you're going to break my sleep and get me up out the bed to come and wait on upperclassmen or something like that, or are you telling me that you're going to put, excuse me, wintergreen in my support and tell me to run around a track while you follow behind me with a bicycle pedaling me, or you're going to tie me up to the tree by the James River and leave me overnight? You've told me already that I'm not, the price is too high. In fact, I didn't, I never pledged a white fraternity, and later on when there was an opportunity to pledge a black fraternity, I didn't pledge that either, because I really didn't see the value of it. For me, if you belong to the church and you had a good family system, that was about it. Now, when it came to a professional organization, I could see that because there was information that you would get about jobs or about doing your job, but I really didn't see the value of fraternities, and I was too independent to be told by a fraternity what my schedule would be. I wanted to control my own schedule.
You were president of the Student Government Association when Randolph-Macon announced its decision to go co-ed. Can you talk a bit about the students' response to going co-ed? I know you and Dean Andrews talked a little bit about that yesterday, but just from how it was to be on campus at that time.
Well, let me say this to you. I love people. It's a God-given thing. I just love people. I guess that was one of my gifts. I love people. And it's been a very helpful gift because that translates in my interaction with people. And if I love people, it follows I love women. In that context, don't go any further with it, okay? The best relationship on this earth is between God and man. If that is the number one relationship, and I believe it is, I believe the number two relationship is the relationship between man and woman. And I believe that there are God-given instincts and interactional patterns that automatically follow when you put man and woman in the same setting. And there's nothing new under the sun. What has happened yesterday is going to happen again today and tomorrow. So when you talk about bringing women to Randolph-Macon, there was some resistance. There was a segment, I guess it was, there were three populations on campus. One population said, well, we don't want them. It's a men's school. It's been a men's school. And I bring women here because it's going to change the tradition and it's going to change the social climate. Another population said, well, donde mejor, so much the better in Spanish. We're running all off campus here now, going to Richmond and going to Mary Washington, University of Richmond, all these other schools looking for women. If they bring women here, it shortens our footsteps. We don't have to run as far to look for women, so we welcome them, and we welcome the changes that go with bringing women here. The third group said, we really don't have an opinion one way or the other. They're going to do what they're going to do. Now, they didn't like being displaced from Mary Branch because they felt that Mary Branch was the center of the campus and that it was the elite dormitory. And I was in Mary Branch, 228. I'll never forget that. And we had the fountain out front. We were just a few steps from the bookstore, which was down the lower level of Mary Branch at that time. We had the snack bar that was on the northern end. Classes were to the east. You had the mailbox between us and Peel Hall. And we were just in the middle of the campus. We were only 10 minutes from the football field, 10 minutes from the basketball court and the swimming, from all of the fraternities. So we were just in the middle of it. So there was some resistance to that. But when they told me I was going to Smith Dorm and took me down and showed me the quarters, I had no complaint. I had no complaint because they put me in a former house mother's facility. It had a kitchenette, a living room, a bedroom, and a bathroom. So now there was some resistance. When I got it, there was a guy named Pilgrim. Pilgrim was his last name, I believe, and Pilgrim and Henry they were in my class, and they were from the Newport News area. And when I moved in to the student government apartment, Pilgrim put shaving cream on my door and set my door on fire. And I didn't know who did it. So at that time, we used to have a ritual where we would come out to the lobby that was right across from my door that had two bathrooms, male and female. And we would watch Johnny Carson from about 11:30 to whatever it was, 12:30, 1 o'clock, something like that. And that was a nightly ritual. So when they set my door on fire, and it was a small fire, it wasn't a big fire, and put the shaving cream on it, I came out in the hall and I said, well, whoever did that, their mom wears combat boots, and a lot of other choice comments I made about their mother. And that was sort of calling them out, It was sort of saying that, own up to it or be identified as a coward. And so I heard people laughing, but nobody stepped forward. But I got the general direction of where the culprit was living. And it was an area of Pilgrim and Henry. So later on, over about 3 or 4 weeks, Henry, who was Pilgrim's roommate, came to me and said, Pilgrim did that. And I said, what? I said, Pilgrim did that. So I was out to get Pilgrim. So I watched Pilgrim's behavior pattern. He had a fixed time to go to dinner and a fixed route that he took. And there was a side door coming into Smith Dormitory that he used. And to make a long story short, I set a trash can full of hot water over top of the door. So that it wasn't scalding hot, but it was just enough to give him the wake-up call. And so when he walked in, the bucket flipped and landed on his head, and it soaked him from top to bottom. And so Henry and I were back in their room. We laughed about it. So later on, we were playing cards, and I had the reputation then of being King Tunk, the best on campus in the game of Tunk, the card game of Tunk. And Pilgrim was losing. So he forgot himself, and he jumped up when he lost a lot of his money and said, called me the N-word, right? And so he forgot where he was in the room. I was between him and the door. So he had to run 360 degrees around me to get to the door to get out of there because he knew I was mad. So I was sitting on a straw chair, a chair that it was wood and it had a straw seat, and it was weaved and put together like that. And it wasn't that strong a chair, but it was fairly sturdy. So I got up, and without thinking, I caught him before he got to the door with the chair and broke the chair across his back. So Henry said, Talk, don't kill him in my room, don't kill him in my room, you know. And so I'm sitting there thinking about the thing, you know. And Pilgrim took off running. And Pilgrim was a Lambda Chi. And Henry was a Lambda Chi. And I socialized with the Lambda Chi's and other fraternities. And I played basketball with some members of the Lambda Chi, to include Jimmy Phelps and Charlie Weston. And Floyd Wingfield, too. They were Lambda Chi's. So I thought about it later, and I said, well, Henry, you didn't tell me not to kill him. You told me not to kill him in your room. I said, what was that about? And Henry said, well, he knew he had stepped across the line, so he had to pay the consequences, but don't get me involved. So next morning, unbeknown to me, it had gone all over campus that I had broke the chair over his back. And at the time, I think it was only 1 or 2 blacks on campus. And the enrollment must have been 800 or 900 students, and there's only 1 or 2 blacks. So I normally ate with the Lambda Chi's because I played basketball with them. It was sort of like an extension of the basketball dinner, you know, eating with those guys. And it was a safety zone for me. So I went to breakfast the next morning, usual time, usual place, and sat right at the table with the Lambda Chi's. And the Lambda Chi's looked around like, gee, he's bold. God, he's bold. He breaks a chair across one of our brothers' back, and then he comes and eat with us, you know. And so Charlie Weston was the peacemaker, and Charlie Weston said, he wanted to know, well, what was that about? What happened, you know? I said, well, you know, he called me a name, and I broke the chair across his back. And I said it matter of fact, you know. And everybody at the table just fell out laughing. And the cafeteria got quiet. They were trying to find out what we were laughing about. And so then Charlie Weston said, well, is it over with? And I said, yeah, he got paid and I got paid. Move on. So they laughed again. So then Charlie Weston said, well, you guys shake hands and make up. So we shook hands. And I shook his hand, you know, and looked him all in the eye like that, and they laughed. And so from that point on, Pilgrim and I became best of friends. But it went around campus. They said, this guy's got to be crazy. Said, there's 2 blacks on campus, and he breaks a chair across a white boy's back and come and sits at their fraternity table. So with me, you know, it was just a matter of fighting for my principles. But with them, they said we wouldn't have done that. So they said I was crazy, which was helpful because crazy in many situations mean that people don't bother you. Prisons, if you're crazy in prison, people don't bother you.
Talking about the women coming on campus and the mindset of the people responding, do you think there were similarities between the experiences of the first women at Randolph-Macon and your experiences, and how or how not?
Well, of course, that was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, women that came in, they had to deal with the resistance coming from faculty and from the students that didn't want them on. And they would complain. The women that you knew would complain to a certain extent about that. At the same time, they had to make the adjustment. And they had the same adjustment that I had to make about coming from their home, leaving the safety of their church and community, and coming to an unknown situation and being pioneers. And it's always difficult when you have to break the ice and open the door because you don't know what's behind the door. Once you've gone through and you've made a report, and drawn the maps and made the reports, it's fairly easy for somebody else to come in because the lay of the land is exposed and drawn out. But those were the negatives. The negatives were that they went through some hazing too. That was not racial discrimination, but gender discrimination. But on the positive side, the ratio was such that when you have 50, 55 women, and you've got about 1,000 students, you got about a, 10, 20 to 1 ratio of men to women. So if you're looking for a boyfriend or husband or something like that, those are good odds. Then there was a positive change in terms of the social climate, because a lot of guys that ran around grubby and having the same clothes on for 2 or 3 days and not taking baths and not shaving and all that, all of a sudden now they start taking care of their hygienes and presenting better. So they improve the deportment of the men. And at the same time, the administration appeared to cater to the women a little more to make them comfortable and to keep them safe. Now, after about 6 months or so, they were fairly comfortable, and we did the raids to the women's dormitories, and when we were taking over Peel Hall and writing out little inflammatory articles in the Yellow Jacket newspaper, they were right there with us. So they got up to speed fairly quick. And it was a different situation when you're majority culture and going through gender discrimination and the majority controls the school. It's different from when you're the minority culture, because they're going to take better care of you. And if you're women, women are sort of coddled in most societies anyway and protected. And they draw the line, and they respond a lot quicker, and they're a lot more forceful when you violate something with a woman as opposed to a man. But it improved. It improved the atmosphere and climate of the college.
Yesterday you mentioned that you thought the student body at Randolph-Macon had changed in its political or social attitudes during your time here, from 68 to 72, 73, which was a big period of upheaval in our society. Could you talk a bit about that transformation regarding the issues of the late 60s and 70s as it affected the students here on campus?
Well, when I came on board, unbeknownst to me, I was under the microscope. And I was later told by people on the administration that they had their little spies giving daily reports on what I did. And that's good management, really, because if you're wanting black students to be integrated into your student population, you have to safeguard the entry and assure that there's safe passage and that they get a fair shot at being good students. And you can't do that without having the information and intelligence to know what's going on. So that was appropriate. But I didn't know it at the time. There was a lot of racial upheaval in 1968 because the death of key civil rights leaders and key black nationalist leaders, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, said to the black community that we want you to stay in your place, and that integration is something that is in our national codes and the Constitution and all Declaration of Independence and all that, but it's not for you. And that caused conflict. By the time I left here, people were more concerned with the war in Vietnam, the Cambodian intervention, whatever was going on with President Richard Nixon in terms of the Watergate scandal. And so there was a change so that the civil rights issue was more on the back burner. That's not to say it wasn't a priority, but it was a secondary priority to the war, because it was comparable to what's going on now in Iraq. You have a lot of people that are concerned now with the number of troops that are dead, that are wounded, whether or not the war will be won, what the cost of the war will be, what the impact on the economy will be. And there was a similarity between that feeling today and what was going on then in 72. And by the time you're a senior, I really had surprised myself in terms of some of the things that I had done. I didn't set out to do anything but graduate. But by the time I had finished at Randolph-Macon, I had been president of student government, president of the Society of Afro-American People, which was a black political organization on campus. I've been on President Luther Weiss' President's Student Life Council. I think that was the name of it. I had been on the Yellow Jacket newspaper staff. I had been on the Judicial Council. I had been second team All-State, second team All-Conference, captain of the basketball team. And socially, I did pretty much what I wanted to do, which was surprising. And it got to a point where the school as a whole embraced me as a student. And they were proud of the fact that I was here, because they had got the idea from my performance that, well, he wants to be respected as an individual, not just a black individual, but as an individual and as a student. And he's doing what he's supposed to do. And so we're going to take pride in the fact that he's our product. And it was nothing for them to say during a basketball game, he's the captain. Jay Pace, who's now deceased, was the director of communications or something like that, but his heart was on basketball. He loved basketball, and he would always pull us aside and talk basketball. And he was a white guy. His father was one of the alumni at that time and one of the biggest contributors to the basketball team. And he would go a lot of times with us on the bus to basketball games. And he would give us a lot of advice. But Jay Pace, during the basketball games, I never heard the basketball games because I was always playing, but people around town would say, well, Jay Pace, when he introduced you, he said you were captain of the basketball team. And by the way, he's also president of the student government. So the public relations piece that went out was very positive. And then in some of the basketball programs, they would say captain of the basketball team, president of student government, which was saying that it cut two ways. It was saying this individual, he had what it took to hold those leadership positions down, and we were progressive enough to give him an opportunity to do it. So it was a win-win situation, and everybody was happy about it.
Can you talk a little bit about the social scene at Randolph-Macon when you were here? What activities did the college offer, and did you feel part of the social scene?
Randolph-Macon, it changed. Excuse me. When I first came, I didn't have a car. I didn't know much about life. I had one girlfriend, and I was a novice in many things. I wasn't very worldly, okay? Randolph-Macon gave you the freshman orientation. It put on maybe 2 or 3 concerts a year that were in the gym at that time. You would have church at the Methodist Church, and you would have the fraternities. Now, if you didn't rush the fraternities, other than those 2 or 3 activities and the sports activities, you could get very bored. I mean, because the sports activities were maybe 1, maybe 2 days a week for what, 2 to 4 hours. Then a concert was only 3 or 4 hours. So if you didn't know anyone and you didn't have a car, the campus was a prison. You couldn't go anywhere. You could only go as far as you could walk. Now, it was a benefit to me that the black community was on the north side of town, what they call Burger Town, which was the north side of Ashland, and I understand that Ashland Incorporated stopped right after the dormitories, and then at that time there were no sidewalks and no plumbing for the black community down there, and the road wasn't paved. So you went from hard top into a gravel road, no plumbing. Then the quality of the housing dropped down, taxed, but no services. And there was a black high school down there by the name of John M. Gandy at that time, and my ex-wife worked in the cafeteria. And I told you that I had a really an out-of-body experience when I first saw her the first day on campus. And some said, ooh, that's the one. And I never forgot, I ended up marrying her. And we had 4 children together. So looking back, knowing her from 1968 and dating her from 1970 on up till we married in 1974, and then when we divorced in 96, a significant part of my adult life was born in Ashland, Virginia. Now, later on, when I got a car my junior year. I bought a 1964 Chevrolet Impala, black 4-door. And it was basic transportation. Wasn't anything to be proud of. It wasn't a show horse, but she ran. And she got me where I wanted to go. So now I could go back, instead of having to hitch rides or borrow cars, I had my own car. Before I could borrow, Charlie Weston had a little Volkswagen. And I would borrow Charlie Weston's Volkswagen about once a month and go to Virginia Union or Virginia State, someplace like that, VCU, or maybe even go back to Arlington. But once I got my own car, now my social range was increased because I had transportation. And life picked up because the car came right at the time when I was getting a lot of leadership positions. And I began to get some recognition in terms of the newspapers. And back at that time, like now, if you're dating, people like to wake up on Friday, Saturday morning and see, oh, that's my boyfriend in the newspaper, and oh, he scored X number of points and blah, 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 this and that. That was sort of an advertisement piece. So you had a lot of attention, and you became known, and there was a certain respect. When I walked around Richmond or walked in the Washington, D.C. area, and they asked, well, where do you go to school? And I said, Randolph-Macon. They did a double take. That was in the black and white community because they knew you were a pioneer. Now, my former father-in-law, Hugh Claiborne, who is now deceased, he was very proud of the fact that I went to Randolph-Macon College. There were blacks who worked in blue-collar jobs at Randolph-Macon College. Lee Taliaferro, in particular, he was the head of the custodian staff. I think they call them sanitational engineers or something like that. And then there was Doug Coleman. We called him Sook. And I can't think of the other guy's name, but they all, 2 or 3 of the custodian staff, particularly Doug Coleman, would, at the end of their tour of duty, come to my room and we would play cards. And my room was always clean and buff. It was always laid out. I had been taught to be clean, and I had been old school in terms of my grandparents having a lot of influence on my upbringing. And when you got up, you washed, then you made up your bed. And, you know, if you need to change your sheets and whatnot, you did that, and you saw that everything in your room was in order before you left to eat. And that was not the rule at Randolph-Macon. When Merle Barton, the former financial director, and Chaplain William Gibson, my advisor, came to my room, they were shocked. They didn't say it, but they did not expect a black guy to be on the cutting edge of cleanliness and housekeeping, but I was. Now, back to my father-in-law, former father-in-law. He would take me around with him. He was very impressed with the fact that though I had an opportunity that he didn't have, that I didn't try to be very arrogant and condescending, that I was an everyday guy. And I would hang out with him. And he would take me to social places that he wouldn't take his sons to, and places that I wasn't supposed to run my mouth about. You know, we're here, but you keep your mouth shut. And when he introduced me, he would always say, this is my son-in-law, you know, when that came, or this is my daughter's fiance. And he would let that sink in after he said, well, this is Dennis Howard. He's my daughter's fiance, my daughter's husband. Then he would say, he goes to Randolph-Macon College. And people would always, the black community wasn't used to a black student at Randolph-Macon College, so they looked at you like you were a leprechaun or something, you know, like you were a dragon breathing fire or something. And I didn't really understand it, but for them, what they were saying was, we've been here 400 years, 300 years, and we've never achieved that. So now you come from Northern Virginia and you open the door. And they were proud of it. And they looked at you, you know, to see what was different about you. And I couldn't really understand it at the time, but I understand it now.
You talked a bit about this. I just wanted to explore a little bit more about the Ashland community. I think 30 years ago, Ashland was even sleepier than it is today. What sort of social things were you able to do in the town? Or you mentioned sometimes going to Richmond. Could you talk about the Richmond community?
Let's do Ashland first. Ashland is a suburban community to Richmond. When I look at the country, the United States of America, I break it down into 3 political entities with geographic boundaries. I think of large cities with large populations, the congestion, the crime, many services, a lot of opportunities, a lot of cutthroat competition as being one area. I think of the suburbs 10, 15 miles away from the cities as being an intermediary zone between the cities and rural areas. And I think of the suburbs as being the place to be. In fact, I've lived in Springfield for 30 years, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C. The suburbs are the place to be because you're in the middle. You're not on the firing line. You don't have all the stress of the city, but you can get to the city in an hour or so. And then when it's time to retreat and come back, you can come to your castle and pull up the moat and be relatively safe. Now, in rural areas, it's a different America. The Republicans in this day like to claim that as middle America. And I didn't appreciate what that was about until I went across the country in 2003 and back again in 2004 when I was mobilizing for the United States Army. There are different values, different opportunities, and rural America, who really is bearing the burden of what's going on in Iraq now, has very few opportunities. And I don't include Ashland, Sleepy Ashland in that, because Ashland is close enough for people to go where the city is or have opportunities here, and it's a short traveling distance. You can get there, it's doable. But in rural areas, you go out way out, 100 miles out, and it might be 100 miles or something to the next biggest city. Your opportunities might be limited to working at Burger Chef or McDonald's or something like a meal, or you might have a company town, Wardock and Craddock, or something like that. And if you don't get in that particular job market, you're going to starve to death or leave. And so I look at Ashland and Randolph-Macon College as being in the perfect zone to go to school. You're close enough to the city to get there, but you don't have all the negatives of the city. It was a good student-faculty population and ratio. You had the black community as a subset of Ashland and the support system there. They were very proud to have a black going to Randolph-Macon College. And they were also very proud that I was dating a girl from Ashland. Now, when I went to Richmond, I mainly went to Virginia Union and Virginia Commonwealth University, and at times I went on further to Virginia State. I found those environments, different kinds of schools, not to say that they didn't have their values and equal quality to them, but there was more parties. And so, and then there were black parties. And there's a difference between a black party and a white party. White people tend to sit and chat. It's intellectual. And black people tend to want to move. It's a thing where they want to dance and they want to learn some new steps and they want to show off some clothes. And they want to, well, I guess both settings want to do the whole dating thing about picking up this one or that one, or, taking your girl and getting out for the night. But there are different kinds of parties and different kinds of experiences. So once I got the car, I was able to go pretty much where I wanted to go. And in fact, they began to have bus trips that went to a lot of the white schools, and some of the women from the black schools in Richmond began to come here and participate in some of our activities. Now, on campus, I took the position I wasn't going to let the white students do anything that I couldn't do. And wherever they went, I was going to go. Whether I like it or not, I was going to keep an eye on what they were doing, because I wanted my experience to be the same or better. And when I went to a bluegrass concert with my ex-wife, she didn't really appreciate it. And, you know, I got there, I heard 2 or 3 songs. I was ready to go too. But the statement was made. I was there. And that said something. And they picked up on what I was doing. They said, well, okay. If there's an opportunity, you're going to check it out. When I bought my ex-wife a Chicago's album as a gift, she gave it back. But again, I had had 6 years of segregated school from the 1st to the 6th grade, and from the 7th to the 8th grade, I had an integrated setting. And I was always a good listener, and I was willing to try something if it was safe. Now, when the Beatles came along, I was with the Beatles. I used to listen to Dylan, Donovan, I would listen to Chicago, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And I would listen to the Righteous Brothers. I went through a thing where my first musical heroes were Dionne Warwick, the Four Tops, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. James Brown, in my opinion, was the best entertainer ever, because not only could he sing, but he could dance, and he could whip a crowd up into a frenzy into his younger day. And I had an opportunity to see many of these people at the Howard Theater in Washington, D.C., which was part of the old black Mecca in terms of what they call the Chitlin Circle. And that was an opportunity where black entertainment was offered to a black crowd when you couldn't go to the white venue. And I had that experience. But I would go down and listen to white music, and white people would come up and listen to black music. And we got to a point where they knew my music and I knew their music. And Ricky Faley rode a motorcycle. He was a close friend of mine, and Ricky Faley was a white guy from Annapolis, Maryland. And I got to be very close with Ricky Faley. He was a loner. He didn't have much money. His family didn't have much money, so he was sort of an outsider. And he got killed on a motorcycle accident. And it had an impact on me. You know, I didn't realize I was that close to Ricky Faley, but I was, and it had an impact on me. And then there was an opportunity on the other end of the socioeconomic political spectrum. There were relatives of the DuPonts and Mellons that went to Randolph-Macon College. And I didn't know, and I didn't care. But at that time, when the door opened and integration was coming in, everybody wanted to experience it. So I was invited at a time, you know, when I was getting into a lot of leadership positions. I was invited to go to one couple. I can't remember the name, but I remember the girl was a relative of DuPonts and the Mellons, one of the two families. And she had a home in Charlottesville. And she took me up with her boyfriend, and my ex-wife and I spent the weekend with him in Charlottesville. And we ended up going to Orange County and going to the steeplechase races and all the big horse country. And I think about it, these people out there with maybe $1,000 worth of of riding gear on, and I'm sitting there with a pair of white shoes and blue jeans and looking very country and out of place, but made to feel comfortable. And it was part of the social experimentation that went on. So it really was a coming out, and Randolph-Macon, I think it grew in terms of opening its doors and allowing change to come in.
Thank you. You mentioned that you have 5 children. Did you encourage any of your children to come to Randolph-Macon? Or why? Why not?
I would have to say that there was indirect encouragement. You have to remember again that I married a woman from Ashland. And Randolph-Macon, you know, when they advertise Ashland, Randolph-Macon is Ashland, you know. And when I would come to visit my mother-in-law and father-in-law, and there were the family extended social activities in Ashland, I would always come through Randolph-Macon. When you come down Henry Street, you have to come down Henry Street, or it's come in Burgertown Road or Berkeley Street or something like that, off Route 1. And Randolph-Macon was always something that came up. And in coming through, I would always say, well, I went to Randolph-Macon, or I stayed in Mary Branch. And when your children are very young, they're very impressionable. You're educating them about your experiences, and by telling them about your experiences, you're opening a door and letting them know that it's something that they can do, because you've done it and they can do it. But did I tell them to go to Randolph-Macon? No. And the reason for that is this. In retrospect, when my mother told me at 17 that I was going to get out at 18, and told me I was going to go into the military, I was going to go to college or get a job and get a room, she was cutting the umbilical cord. And that was a key part of the separation and individuation process that adolescents go through. And it worked for me because it gave me a wake-up call, and it challenged me to stand up on my own 2 feet and be a man. But at the same time it challenged me, it let me decide what direction I was going in. My grandfather, the late Deacon Clarence Gibson from the First Baptist Church of Maryfield, Virginia, was probably my best mentor in life. And he had always told me to be a leader. And the way he said it, you know, older folks, they had a way of making everything so simplistic. And to me, that's the art of communication. It's not the big 50-cent words that you learn in college at the PhD level, you know, that only 2 or 3 people can understand. It's putting it where everybody can understand it. And he told me, he said, Dennis, don't be a follower, be a leader. He said, if you look out and you see a mountain or you see a hill and it's just snowed and there are no footprints on the snow, it's clean, pure snow, you make your own path. Don't you follow in somebody else's path. You make your own path, and then you let people follow your path. And I've never forgotten that. And so the short of it was, the experience had worked for me, and so I wasn't going to dictate to my children where they were going to go. Now, once they had made their choice, I would support their choice, because that was my job as a parent. And I didn't feel it was my job as a parent to determine which path in the snow they made.
Thank you. Well, as you think about Randolph-Macon and your experience here, how do you think your education at Randolph-Macon helped you in your career as a social worker?
Well, again, Randolph-Macon gave me an opportunity on a larger stage, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant stage, to come through the door and get an opportunity to compete and to get very positive results. And once I had done that, it gave me the confidence and it gave me the process and discipline to make decisions and to plan how to get where I was going so that I was a confident individual. The degree opened a lot of doors, and the education gave me a foundation in basic subject matter that let me understand and decode my environment. So that was very important. And the other piece that Randolph-Macon gave me was it taught me that you had to judge each person individually and that you had to listen to what that person was saying, respect their views, and also it taught me that everybody responds to love and caring on an individual level. And those were very important things that carried over into social work, because when I went to Lynchburg, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, and took a job as a social worker for Family Services of Central Virginia. And I had to do individual marriage and family counseling with a white population that was not used to black social workers. I had to have the confidence to go in and present as a social worker that was confident enough to do the job. I couldn't go in weak, unassertive, and feeling that I was somehow in a caste system and not able to compete with white folks. I had to go in and most times I had to be a generic social worker, not a black social worker, not a white social worker, just a social worker. And that came off well. I remember that when I first started off with Bill Aiken, who was the former director of Family Services of Central Virginia in 1976, and I was there until 1977. I spent about just under 2 years there. We used to do a family life education series in the community. It was an outreach program that dealt with all of the big issues that were out at that time: marriage, divorce, drugs, how you deal with adolescents. There were 9 settings that we went to, and there was one black setting. And we had 3 social workers, 2 white females, 1 black male. The white female social workers were from Pennsylvania and Gretna, Virginia. Bill gave the 1 black setting to me and gave the 2 white females 4 opportunities each. So when we came back in and had done it 2 or 3 months in a row, I saw that the pattern had stuck. So I saw that he was basically labeling me as the black social worker. And so I confronted him in the staff meeting. I said, Bill, why are you sending me only to the black jobs? Do you think I don't have the ability to do the job in the white section, or do you think that they won't accept me, or some combination of both? And he turned red. whether he did it subconsciously or deliberately, whatever, that was the effect that it had. And he said, well, I'll change that. Good for him. Now, what happened was that once I went to the white communities and got through some basic resistance, when they saw that I had the training and experience to get the job done, they liked the novelty of the situation. We had a black social worker come here. And then they had a whole dialogue that went on about that. What did he do differently? What did he say? How did he approach it? And it did something to expand the whole conversation. And so it got to a point where when I finally came back to the Washington metropolitan area, there was a glut of social workers when I first graduated from Howard University, and I had to go to Lynchburg to get my first job, postgraduate. But when I came back to Washington, D.C., I went to Children's Hospital National Medical Center, and they were recruiting in adolescent medicine social workers to deal with primarily a black adolescent population. And they wanted black social workers. So they did a national search and came up with 2 social workers, 1 black female for a supervisory job and 1 black male for the second position. And they got me. Now, in that setting, it was like a Top Gun setting because it was a multidisciplinary setting that was under the jurisdiction of the Health and Human Services Maternal and Child Health Department, which was federal. And you had top doctors, medical doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, nurses, and teachers competing in a multidisciplinary setting and training people to do those jobs. It was an honor and a blessing to go there. Now, the confidence and the skills that I had, the degree that I had from Howard University and Howard opened the door, but the confidence that I had gotten from Howard and from Randolph-Macon let me know that I could work both sides of the street and get it done. Then it also taught me how to compete. And so basically, it just took off from there, and you learn different skills along the way.
Thank you. You've really reflected very well on your experiences at Randolph-Macon and all throughout your life. And I wonder if you had any closing thoughts about your time here, and or whatever closing thoughts you had for us today.
Well, I'd like to say this. I think the best way I can sum it up is this. When you look at education, you have to determine what the goal of education is. And in determining what the goal of education is, you determine what path you're going to take to get education. Now, I look at education as the ability to decode the environment and survive, and to get what you need out of life to survive at the level that you want to survive at. Now, you have to think about that in terms of education on earth in this world and education for the world after. Now, I think we had a real crossroads with education now. I think that wealth is basically a good relationship with God, a good relationship with spouse, having your children's children grow up at your knee, long life, and good health. Now, my grandmother and grandfather had those things as 5th and 6th grade dropouts. They had 13 kids, they had 50-some grandkids, They had 75 great-grandkids. They lived to be 82 and 93 years of age. They died with plenty of family around them. They lived on a 12-acre farm. They never wanted for anything, but they struggled earlier on because God blessed them. Now, that's wealth according to the definition of God. But if you talk about wealth according to the definition of the world, and you start out to be the president, to live in a mansion, to have 100 acres, to have servants, to have big cars, to be on the social register, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to have the material things of this world, that's a very hard road to hoe. And I think we're at a point now when we're working with the global marketplace and very automated systems and rapid transportation and communication. The rich will rule the poor as they always have. Now, the rich have said, we're going to go beyond the political boundaries of countries. We're going to tap the best trained individuals in every country of the world. What that means is that they have increased the supply of workers that are available to them. They have also lowered the wages that they're going to pay. If they go to an India or China, they might pay 10 cents on the dollar of what they pay to us. So what that means is at some point we're going to have a glut in this market, and we're going to have to diversify to be competitive, or we're going to have to follow the money internationally when you're talking about the educational process. So getting back to the male and the female student, you're going to have to ask yourself very early, do I want to spend years in school getting a PhD until I'm 30? Do I want to marry at 30? Do I want to have one child? You're going to have to ask yourself about the sexually transmitted diseases that are rampant. The whole marketplace has changed, and it's very volatile. And with a depression alleged to be coming on, that becomes even more of a question. So the change that I had, or the environment that I had 35 years ago, was much more stable. All we had to worry about was gonorrhea and syphilis. These students today have a much more volatile, a much more competitive market, and they are not assured of getting the opportunities that we got. So they're going to have to make good decisions, and they're going to have to make it in a very short span of time. And I challenge them to make the right decisions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennis Howard, very much for participating in Making Memories. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.